I'm joined now by Wes Streeting, Shadow Health Secretary and MP for Ilford North for Labour. Wes, lovely to see you this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for joining
being here.
me. Thanks for having me on.
Let's ask you first of all for your reaction to what's gone on in Israel over the past 24 to 48 hours.
I think the barbarity that we're seeing unfolding on our television screens and on our social media feeds is horrifying. I cannot imagine what people in Israel are going through, and I mean literally cannot imagine what it must be like to be under that kind of threat of violence, kidnap, murder. I think there's no justification for it whatsoever. It needs to be unequivocally condemned. And to those who support the cause of Palestinian human rights and statehood, as I do, and I think most of us would, this isn't resistance we're seeing, it's terrorism, and our country's got to stand against it and stand with Israel's right to defend itself.
On that note, I mean, I know you've always been very strong in your positioning about past association with anti-Semitism in the party. As you say, Hamas is a terrorist organisation, yet we've seen some people celebrating this in the streets of London. I mean, should the police investigate them for hate crimes potentially, do you think?
Certainly, I think they need to look at whether crimes are being committed here. And I would say to people who, I think with justification, worried about Palestinian human rights, worried about the escalation of violence, want to see a state of Palestine alongside a state of Israel, what we're seeing on our screens not only can't be justified in human terms, and the barbarity and the fear that the families are going through, it also sets back the cause of peace.
Yes.
And so people celebrating on the streets of London and elsewhere in the UK got to ask themselves, where is their humanity? And do they think that that's going to build support for a just cause or set it back? Because I genuinely believe the only future for Israelis and Palestinians is a two-state solution through peaceful negotiation.
Yeah.
And the pursuit of that cause is made harder, not easier, by what we've seen.
Can I just point out some of your colleagues are going to be attending pro-Palestinian events in the coming days at conference. We already saw your colleague Asbana Begum, who's the Labour MP for Poplar and Limehouse. She was posing with Palestinian activists yesterday. We've got John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor, Jess Barnard, who's on Labour's NEC, Mick Whelan, the General Secretary of ASLEF, all planning to go to a Justice for Palestine event on Tuesday. Is this appropriate?
Well, I would draw a distinction between legitimate and serious events and campaigning for a just cause and the celebration of violence. But what I would say to people in this of all weeks, if you are going to attend such events or show your support for the just cause of a Palestinian state, also take the opportunity to condemn unequivocally the violence that we're seeing perpetrated against Israelis, because we in the Labour Party, we support a two-state solution, we support the Palestinians' right to their own state, but we stand unequivocally with Israel and her right to defend herself.
Some of the organisers here.
I mean, I can't imagine what would,
But some of the organisers of these events,
we defend ourselves.
They're planning to march on the Israeli embassy. I mean, that is totally inappropriate for any Labour MP to be associated with people doing that.
The only march that should be taking place on the Israeli embassy today is a march of solidarity with the Israeli people and with those families that have lost loved ones or are desperately frightened for loved ones. That's the solidarity that should be shown today.
John McDonnell needs to think twice about seeming to be on the side of some of these Palestinian activists at this time. Show some sensitivity.
I'd just say, particularly against this backdrop, the horrifying scenes we've seen on our television screens, condemn unequivocally the violence, the senseless violence
and if they don't?
Against Israelis. I actually think they will, because I think that I don't understand how, as a human being, you could see these scenes and not show compassion and support for families that are going through something that I simply can't imagine.
Let's move on to your brief, because you're the man who hopes to be the next health secretary. You've announced that you're trying to cut waiting times. We've heard from Keir Starmer today as well. He's given an interview to the Sunday Mirror where he says he's got a 1.5 billion plan to bring these numbers down. How How are you going to do that? Not least when you talk about more diagnostic testing, you're going to need more staff. And that's been a problem for the NHS for the last 3 decades or more.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's why we're committed to the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history, doubling the number of doctors, more nurses, the staff that the NHS needs to treat patients on time. But everyone knows that takes time. And we can grip the immediate crisis in the NHS of the backlog on the waiting lists if we're smart about how we use the capacity that's there in the system. So using tried and tested methods that are already being used in a small number of NHS trusts in the country, but could be deployed elsewhere, we will fund £1.1 billion for evening and weekend clinics, delivering 2 million more appointments a year. That's
and aren't you going to get pushback from the unions on that, though? Do they want to work evenings and weekends?
Well, look, I can offer them the reassurance that staff are not going to be compelled to do this. We don't need all staff, anything like all staff, to do this.
You're going to have enough staff to do it, then?
When I have spoken to the unions about it, I think what they say is, as long as it's not compulsory and as long as staff are paid fairly,
but
which they would be, it's £1.1 billion into the pockets of NHS staff. Yeah, because I think, look, this is where the government have got it fundamentally wrong on the NHS workforce. The doctors, the nurses, the midwives, the porters, the cleaners who got us through some of the darkest times in the history of the NHS with the pandemic, they really care about their patients. They're willing to go the extra mile.
But you've got doctors, junior doctors still on strike. I mean, would you give them 35%? How much would you give them?
I've been honest with them and said we can't afford 35%.
Can we put a number on it?
But the beauty of what we've proposed with the 2 million more appointments is that's £1.1 billion into the pockets of NHS staff.
How much would you give them to stop them from striking?
Well, they know I'm not going to do shadow negotiations.
Well, go on, just give us a general ballpark.
No, I'm not going to do shadow negotiations.
Is 35 too much?
If I were
little?
the health secretary today, I wouldn't be daft enough to give away my negotiating position. And I actually wouldn't expect the government to either. But we would be willing to sit down and negotiate. And I think, again, that's where Rishi Sunak's got this wrong, because he's not done a single day of negotiation with NHS staff.
Yeah.
And given the damage the strikes are doing to the NHS,
but we would like to get a ballpark from Labour, I think. I think it's fair to ask, when people have had their hospital and doctor's appointments delayed and there's 7.6 million waiting, we would like to know from Labour, how would you solve it? What would you give them?
And I think the reassurance I can give is that during the last Labour government, there were no national strikes in the NHS, because we treated staff fairly, we negotiated with them, and we worked with them to deliver the shortest waiting times
Your
and the highest patient
plans for the
satisfaction in
NHS
history.
involve more privatisation?
Not privatisation. We will work with the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists faster, for the simple reason we've got a 2-tier NHS in our country at the moment, where those who can't get seen are left behind, and those who can afford to pay private are getting seen faster.
Have you ever paid privately?
No, I did when I worked at Comet. This is going to see how old I am now. When I was a student, I needed a small operation,
but is it fair enough if
I had private insurance provided by my employer. I'm not going to judge people who go private. I'm not going to judge employers who provide private medical insurance or staff who take it up. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable choice to make. But what I want to make sure is that no one in this country ever feels forced to go private or gets left behind if they can't afford to go private. And I want to make the NHS so good that no one in our country feels the need to go private.
A couple of questions from Tony. First of all,
I was trying to read his lips to see what the question was.
He was talking about bus franchising. Will you bring that back? And he was also asking about social housing. I mean, it's obviously easy to criticise the Tories for 13 years of not enough house building, but equally they'll turn around and say there wasn't enough house building under Labour. Yeah, and that's a fair criticism as well, which you take on the chin. I'll say 2 things in response to that. First is we can already see the difference that Labour in power is making. Look at what Andy Burnham has done in Greater Manchester, bringing the buses back in-house, better value for taxpayers, lower fares for passengers, and we're seeing other Labour mayors doing similar things. We want a Labour government support people right across the country to deliver better bus services. And on the second point, which was just remind me about franchises, and sorry, we talked about that. Social housing. Forgive me.
Yeah. So look, fair criticism that successive governments have got this wrong. Angela Rayner, who is now Shadow Housing Secretary, like me, grew up in a council flat. We relied on it.
How many more would you build?
Well,
have you got a target?
Angela's setting out her stall this week, so you can see in her speech.
What would you like to see it be? 300,000 a year or something like that?
Well, I'm not going to pluck a figure out of thin air.
We're reluctant to pluck figures out of thin air. We would like to know, because you do want to govern this country.
I'll tell you why, and you'll be able to see everything spelled out in our manifesto. we're determined to make sure that every promise we make is a promise we can keep, because turning around this country's challenges...
Well, you say that. I mean, Keir Starmer said in 2015 he wanted to scrap HS2. Now he wants to keep it. He says he doesn't want to go back into the EU, but David Lammen is suggesting that he does. He's flip-flopped on quite a lot of policies. One minute they're stripping private schools of their charitable status, the next he's rode back on that.
Oh, hang on a
You've
second.
got a green prosperity pledge that Rachel Reeves has now said we can't afford. So he is Captain Flip-Flop, isn't he?
No, and I'll tell you what, on HS2, quite reasonably as a local MP, Keir had concerns about the disruption that would occur to some of the housing in his constituency. Those concerns were addressed. He thinks it's an important national infrastructure project. The whole Labour Party does. The government's just blown a hole in it.
Would you insist that some of the people who had to compulsorily sell their houses for a line that's no longer being constructed should be able to buy them back?
I bet they're feeling sick, and I bet they're feeling furious, and they should be. And what it says, and this is my deep anxiety about it, what it says is, in addition to the lost opportunity of the new rail infrastructure, the jobs, the opportunities and the supply chain, it also says to international investors and to other countries, Britain can't do big infrastructure anymore. And what a tragedy. We've got some of the best builders, the best architects, the most creative designers in this country. We can do big infrastructure.
So more HS2 from Labour?
But you need leadership. The problem is, Camilla, I would love to be able to say, look, don't worry, guys, we'll be in and we'll do HS2, but the government have blown a hole in it.
You need to leave it there, Wes. Thank you very much, Wes Streeting. Lovely to see you this morning.
Thanks for having me.